Hello, my name is Artie Davis, and welcome to Business Accelerator 2022. The Business Accelerator is launched by Civi and done in partnership with the Government of the Netherlands and Meta. These episodes look to understand how best to bring industry to the table when it comes to corporate water stewardship. Today's edition will focus on water-wise investments, and with us on the panel we have Stephen Lloyd, Sustainable Advisory, Arup, UK, Sarah Beth Broccoli, Senior Lead Advisor, ESG and Corporate Services, NASDAQ, Frank Wagenheims, Senior Engagement Specialist, Acme Investment Management, and Maeve Hall, Sustainable Manufacturing Water Lead, Unilever. So welcome to the panel today. So I want to start today by asking all of you one question, and to go one by one to get your answers. But before I do that, I'd like to give you a set of assumptions. In order to bring industry to the table, which we sorely need, we have to learn how to quantify risk and return when it comes to water management. This requires data. Without data, we have to then assume we cannot bring investment and industry to the table. So my question to you is, given these assumptions, do we have sound water management with us today? And if we don't, what is the impact of that? Frank, I want to start with you.
Well, the short answer is no. Yes, there's increasingly information available on water use by companies. We get slightly better insights on what the risks and chances are. But I think if you compare the ESG data on water to, for example, the climate mitigation side, we are still lagging. And that also means that maturing water as a responsible investment team, well, there's still quite a lot of work to be done.
Sarah Beth?
Yeah, I think generally from my perspective where I sit, I would like to give a big shout out to a quote that stuck with me from last year. But Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's partner at Berkshire Hathaway, has a great quote that we should keep in mind throughout this. The iron rule of nature is you get what you reward for. So if you want the ants to come, you have to pour sugar on the floor. Tom Ferguson from Burnt Island Ventures, who just closed on a $30 million fund series raise for water startups, opened our financial session on our discussion last year, keeping that in mind. And I'd love to keep that theme through, but it's all about incentives.
Exactly. Creating water heroes and creating incentives to actually nudge behavioral change. Stephen, what's your answer to the question?
Thanks, Arati. Well, in terms of water issues across global industrial sectors, it is clear that water insecurity is impacting companies through stranding of assets. CDP research shows that 15 billion has been stranded or is at risk, and the top 20 investment firms have invested 2.5 trillion in the world's most water impacted companies in the last 10 years. So energy producers can be impacted by availability of cooling water, huge amounts of water used in mining processes, weather events can severely impact transmission assets. So despite these disclosures encouraged by CDP, lots of businesses still don't consider their water risks. There's huge amounts at risk, and a high level of non-reporting research shows the current system isn't adequate. And currently, much collection of data really only focuses around water consumption. And there's many attempts to consolidate and unify ESG reporting, and I'm sure we'll come on to those in a few minutes.
Maeve, finally with you, as the voice of industry, what's your feedback?
I'd say there's a lot we can learn from work that's already been done in terms of natural catastrophe modelling, that there's already loads of data been put forward. I mean, my ultimate position is there's enough data to indicate that there is action needed, and we need to get going because there's like a real, the impetus is now to act. And so I think there's enough data available for us to start acting today.
I think that's great. I think in this opening kind of questionnaire and answers, we've got the key words that we will, I think, come back to again and again on this panel. And I think many of them are how water needs to catch up. There's been a lot of measuring done so far, but maybe done for a different audience and different outputs. Mm-hmm. We need to bring that together so water becomes part mainstream and a result of the complex outcomes required. But I want to come to Frank's question on that. You mentioned the elephant in the room, Frank, and quite early on we're going to bring that elephant into the room, and that's climate. And a lot of the ESG metrics, a lot of the disclosure metrics being catered towards a climate-constrained world, which does not necessarily forego water, but does not necessarily reflect water in its complexity. And there needs to be a translation then, when we're looking at industry and water, to translate between the watershed and the investor, and to create that understanding of what needs to be added. I'd really like your comments on that.
Yeah, and in that sense, there's a lot of work to be done. And so we also worked at the beginning of this year together with WWF and Deltares to map what ESG data do we have on water and where are the gaps. The good news is there is increasingly information and corporate reporting, but there are also quite some gaps. So first of all, you see that water reporting and ESG data is mainly focused on water use by companies by their own operation. So the supply chain perspective is lagging, in which, of course, a large part of the water footprint is present. There's often a focus on quantity. So that also means the pollution, but also the temperature of the water discharge is left out. And as water is contextual, if you focus on corporate reporting, you often miss the contextual data about when is the water used? Is it used in a dry season or in a wet season? In which watersheds is the water used? Are they at water stress? Are they water stressed? And how do companies interact with other users in the water basin? So I think that information is often out there, but there's also often a sort of disconnect between the knowledge and the perspective of the water sector and the water experts and the investment community. So there are 3 steps at least to be done. That means investors should deepen their knowledge on water itself, and knowing it's a sort of a different beast than climate mitigation, which you can get kind of a long way with just one metrics. But water experts should also get a more sense about which data investor needs, and that's often less on the operational level, but more on the strategic and the governance level. And thirdly, also companies should step up and report more, not only on the operational water use, but also on the supply chain where the risks are, doing climate scenarios, but also provide contextual data. Where is the water used? In which watersheds? Where are the risks and where are the opportunities also to work with local water actors?
And Frank, I think you touch upon something really important, is that we talk about bringing industry to the table, but we're looking at collective action across stakeholders. So we need to create understanding of how everyone can come together in this discussion. And Stephen, I know you've been doing some work in terms of the public-private space and working with public agencies to create win-win scenarios and to create simplicity out of what can seem to be a chaotic, overwhelming information indulge.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks. And I think building on what we've just been talking about, I mean, I think start by suggesting that quite rightly, there's a key focus for ESG disclosure on climate mitigation and greenhouse gas reduction. But beyond that, there's a real confusing array of different reporting frameworks and dozens of measures, and companies, investors often report long lists of not very inspiring or impactful metrics. That really kind of drives a compliance tick box approach. Investors can't possibly focus across so many agendas. And by creating this long list of measures, you can't prioritize or sufficient impact. And this really opens the sector up to accusations of greenwash, lots of compliance data, but no real demonstration of impact. So at Arup, we're really encouraging investors to identify a shorter list of critical factors, the most relevant and the value to the business. And we assess and quantify the value impact of that at the investment stage, and then post-investment help build the plan to deliver on it. This really helps sort of give investors a clear focus and a clear purpose across several of these objectives, identify the right hierarchy, responsive interventions so you can deliver multiple benefits. So I think, amidst all the noise and the critical issues we see impact investors are both, climate mitigation adaptation, but there's also a critical need to sustain nature, develop natural resources that are to ensure health and well-being for all and deliver a just and equitable transition. And investments in water are unique, actually. They offer solutions across all of those factors.
Stephen, I'm actually going to ask you a follow-up, because when we spoke, you talked about the Shanghai example. And I think it's great in these conversations to get that case study referencing, that we're not being as abstract, and we can actually have these win-win scenarios against multiple kind of stakeholders in this discussion. It'd be great to get like a quick summary of that example and how you manage that. Yeah,
thanks. I mean, the context here is we're really trying to drive nature-based solutions at scale, and how can we really implement a nature-driven approach. And nature creates a win-win on not only around nature, but also on carbon. So a really great example of this, where a nature-based approach was adopted, integrated, was the work we've done in Shanghai Master Plan that we're now replicating around the world. Shanghai is a sinking city, and their solution was to propose massive $40 billion series of interceptor tunnels. What we used is we implemented a series of blue-green assets across the entire city. We identified that using satellite and AI technology, artificial intelligence, and it hugely reduced the scale and cost of the grey interventions. And it's going to create huge improvements in air quality, public spaces to play and live. The community is actually actively engaged in delivery and management of the green assets. And this is really transforming what was a heavily engineered grey scheme focused on one ESG target, really into an integrated nature-based approach that delivers benefits right across the multiple categories of the E, the S, and the G.
I think that's great because we get to see kind of concrete examples of how this can be done. A lot of times we end the discussion with that there is a conflict, there is a friction, how do we get to the next step? But there are examples already out there of how that kind of 360 approach can already be implemented and deployed. But of course, in addition to kind of having the metric discussion in terms of water versus climate, there is the discussion of measurement and data. You can only manage what you measure. And Sarah, like you say, if you pour the sugar, the ants will come. You've got to create clear signages, clear indicators of what we need to work towards. And one of the, of course, when it comes to greenwashing, when it comes to other challenges on disclosure, it becomes, do we have the data to measure what we need? We do when it comes to climate. Do we have it when it comes to water? And if we don't, what does industry do to build that muscle? I know NASDAQ works with your portfolio companies to kind of provide that muscle to companies who need to understand how do you incorporate this measurement and how can it help you? It'd be great to get your feedback.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think generally we always take a capital markets approach and lens. And my background's been in sustainability for the past 10 years, but focused capital market sustainability obviously is different than from some other nonprofit and governmental related sustainability. And we keep that top of mind, knowing that we work with a number of different stakeholders across the spectrum. But I firmly believe through data and when I work with member companies that are listed on the exchange, we all know that responsible investors can play a huge role in water stewardship and efforts, primarily just by redefining what their stewardship policies are. When we think about the ESG checkbox data rating game, it's an over $1 trillion business. We know this. It's exciting, lots of startups and action in this space, but so much data does not mean good data. And all of us on this panel know that. Mm-hmm. But how you interpret, quantify, and then utilize that to improve X is important. So with a growing spotlight on water sustainability, then it's also shining brightly on water investing specifically. So from my perspective, when we look at ratings reports, it's specifically MSCI, ISS, and Sustainalytics. There's a number of other ones on market, but when we think about which investors focus on which materiality reports most, there's the top three. Everything else is noise in the space, not of value. In rates a little bit different in European markets, so I'll give a nod over to my UK colleagues there, but it's a big, difficult game to understand, and water is so poorly articulated through those metrics. And if you're asking companies to respond to a partial check the box exercise and then still asking them to imbue it into their sustainability plans writ large, so not just ESG and financial materiality, but also what does it mean to participate in this global agenda, you're having a lot of difficulty in managing water risk because you're not telling what that climate impact is, what that biodiversity risk might be. And companies generally are behind this, but if they don't have to report into a particular metric that's outside of the physical or volumetric quantification of water as one checkbox on the MSCI survey, for example, there won't be that response rate. You see CDP coming up into a very specific way of looking at tailoring questions for water security. But if it doesn't sit at that first gate check for investor networks and for stewardship policies, it's dead in the water.
I think that's great. And I want to touch upon what you said, Sarah, both because Frank mentioned when we started about the paper you did with WWF, basically taking in how do you cancel out the noise? You bring in the experts and you institutionalize the experts into corporate water strategy and into management. And Sarah Beth, I want to touch upon you actually and your background and who you are with NASDAQ right now. I think this multi-stakeholder perspective to bring experts into a realm that have the water focus in traditionally the industry that doesn't actually know what to do with that information. You need advisors. You need people to actually push out the data that isn't important. And I think it's great for you to talk about that and who you are and where you come from and the fact that you're sitting at NASDAQ doing what you do.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally when you hitch the word advisor onto anything, there's always a lot of panache and then sometimes a misunderstanding of what it actually means. But we sit across a number of different companies that obviously list with NASDAQ. Xylem's one of them, one of the largest water utility companies in the United States, all the way down to regional banks who have to try to quantify a specific type of climate risk readiness programming or water risk readiness programming. And it's hard to articulate why that might be financially material to a bank that really doesn't use water unless they turn a tap on. So what is their focus in on trying to participate on a global agenda of data migration or data understanding when you are trying to figure out why water scarcity matters? So worked at the United Nations for a while in the energy, water, and capacity developing space, knowing that the private sector really focuses in on, I think, actioning a lot of the governance work that I've previously worked on is exciting for me. And one of the reasons why I moved into financial markets is because there's a clear story to tell and a really cool seat to be guiding some of those policies when you're looking at companies that might just be getting started or very mature on their ESG work. It helps you understand a little bit more about, again, I think we all discussed on the call, like what is not greenwashing and what is specific strategy for a company that might not see their material risk in water valuation, but can still have a large comment on water stewardship and the ramifications for supporting that agenda.
Absolutely. I think it's filtering that information. And Frank, you've done that paper with WWF. You work with the pension funds. You're actually acting as that kind of conduit to take the information, to take the data and make it actually deployable and actionable. And that's actually been a lot of the engagement we talked about. It'd be great to hear what you think about the question on how do you educate investors in a way that they're not overwhelmed every year with new information, new metrics, and new ways of acting.
Well, I think it's kind of unfortunate, but it also has a positive side. In Europe, there's of course a big drought happening at this moment, and I think for a lot of investors now, something they saw as a sort of theoretical problem becomes very visible. So, like utility companies in France, we just can't use the cooling water at this moment. Food and beverage companies will see that their supply is drying up in a sense. So I think this real world examples touches a button, touches a switch that investors are increasingly taking it seriously, but secondly, I think there's an increasing attention and increasing focus on responsible investment. And the interesting thing about water is that it connects themes. It connects climate adaptation. It connects economic development. It connects human rights. It connects economic development. So although it's a sort of unfortunate event, I think the current drought, the current weather, especially in Europe, but also in other parts of the world, helps investors to get educated and to hopefully get them moving on this topic.
Never waste a good crisis. Absolutely. And I think we'll have more opportunities as we go forward in the next couple of years. We're just starting out. But Maeve, I come to you. It's not the last question, but I left industry to be the last speaker on the question panel. You've been listening to what we've been saying about what it takes to bring companies like yours to the table, multinational companies that exist across global areas. What do you think Unilever, for example, needs to get to be able to get closer to the global water stewardship agenda and take actionable impact?
Yeah, so I'm here representing Unilever and industry, so I hope I do industry proud, but I'm just speaking from my own personal experience. So Unilever water is an essential part of our business. It's needed to grow and make raw materials, needed for our manufacturing sites as an ingredient, but also to heat, clean and cool our products. And probably most fundamentally, it's needed by our consumers to wash their clothes and their hair or to make their dinner. So what I found is a real key enabler in terms of increasing priorities around water within our business has been disclosure. So both CDP and the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which has really provided us with a vocabulary and a structure to get water risks on the agenda and into our annual report and accounts. So now water is one of our principal risks embedded within the climate change risk. And this moves the agenda on from one which is solely looking at reduction of our water footprint to now one which is focused around dependencies and growth. So then risk management initiatives are then built into our compass, which is our integrated business strategy to deliver growth. And through 12 climate and nature goals, which span across our value chain, we're addressing water security and water stewardship, with it very much at the heart of our climate adaptation agenda. But we recognise fully that we can't do this alone, like no company is an island. And so there's two other engagements that we're part of as within our programme. And the first is 2030 Water Resources Group, which is a multi-stakeholder platform which works with key governments to support policy reform and infrastructure investments into water resource management at scale. And the second is something that was launched at COP26, which is the Glasgow Declaration for Fair Water Footprints, which seeks to use trade really as a mechanism for driving improved water management. And it's levers like these which are really important in order to incentivize greater action and really raise the floor for all, creating climate resilience for all. So just to say, we're still at very early stages of our engagement into the water space. We don't have all the answers at all, but what's worked for us is really 1, disclosure and prioritization, 2, evolving that narrative from efficiency to risk and growth, and 3, seeing how we can use our voices to advocate and support others to mobilize change.
Maybe that's great. I want to actually ask you a follow-up question on that, because, of course, the Glasgow Declaration is really a collective action declaration to bring all partners to the table, not just industry, but government, academia, the public sector, government agencies, to really see how they all play a part here. But when it comes to industry taking a lead on this or joining forces, what I want to ask you is maybe I can go to someone else while you prepare the answer, but let's see. I want to know, as Unilever, you stand across spaces on the planet. You've got work in the UK, in the EU, in India, very different water scenarios, very different water footprints. And of course, any standardization or decision you take as industry applies very differently in all these different areas, which can be a huge positive change. Because if you take a position that is relevant to the EU, there's a lot of work that can be done in emerging economies like India to meet those standards or to achieve those standards. How do you see that working when it comes to industry stewardship for water, given the spectrum where Unilever actually operates?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely that. It's about having a system which is flexible to account for the local needs and requirements, given that water is so locally relevant. But I think it's also having the ability to then roll these things up and discuss them and talk about them at a global level or at a corporate level, so that you can really create those synergies with others, but also with government and different collectives.
Thanks, and sorry for bringing that in out of nowhere, but I think it's an amazing opportunity to have this discussion with companies like Unilever, given that you work in so many different areas. But Stephen, on that question, where you bring in industry to lead the change when it comes to nudging behavioral change for public sector, how do you see that working out in the future? Where do we go, given Unilever and companies like them have such a huge leveraging power?
Thanks. So I think there's an opportunity for large corporations and investors and public sector to work together. We're really seeing sort of two places for that. Either in the upper, a big opportunity around upper catchments and how you can sort of do things differently there. And we really see cities as great conveners of solutions around big water challenges in those two places. So we're really seeing real innovation around in the upper catchments, around working with agriculture and farmers to do sort of to do solutions around avoiding pollution actually in the watershed rather than end of pipe. Real innovations there, working together collaboratively, need new governance, new frameworks. And in cities, we're really sort of seeing that the water water cycle is so fragmented, if you can work across the governance and get parties to work together, with the public sector maybe as the convener, but the water operator, the investors, and other stakeholders really working together, environmental regulators, you can really sort of drive much more innovation and much more collaborative approaches. Very often sort of coming back to this kind of using nature, using water to drive multiple agendas, really driving decarbonisation, driving healthier places to live, and really sort of driving integrated solutions.
I think innovation becomes key to driving this forward. And of course, there's a lot of startups in the world now creating ease of actually measurement and ease of engagement. AI, you touched upon, of course, is a huge opportunity for data measurement for water. But of course, companies don't necessarily know this. It might be beyond their professional radar to know how to actually measure. Where do they get that information? How do they actually achieve an understanding of the complexity? And Sarah Beth, I can see you nodding your head because I'd actually like to come to you on that and say, how do we provide cutting edge technology and information to industry who want to actually impact change?
Gosh, there's so much to unpack there. It's such a good question, but I think it's always a question of, if it was the right technology, it would have already been deployed. And we constantly come up against that level of mismanagement of ideas, right? The right performance at the wrong price or cost structure is ultimately the wrong technology. And we don't allow enough room for water startups in this space to provide a number of different elegant solutions because we need more space to iterate. So that aside, there are a couple of standouts that are coming onto market that we at NASDAQ watch with a careful eye because we're always hoping to suss out who we can have list on our markets compared to New York Stock Exchange. But all jokes aside, things like Storm Sensor that provide this type of real-time data and reaction to disaster risk mitigation opportunities, or looking at agricultural drip products that, again, can distribute specific nutrient-dense considerations or solutions to products no matter where the geography sits. So if it's dry, if it's wet, it can make those minute changes. But those are all demonstrations of iterations that we need to allow the water community to have more flexibility in, instead of demanding that there's some one type of one size fits all place. And I think one of the other interesting facts is, if you switch over to the investment side, you already know that if you're doing water investing via funds, you usually get used to tight portfolios. And there's not a lot of leeway in this space yet. NASDAQ has a couple of different ETFs that track different water utility and water indices worldwide, but it's not enough. And I always joke with a lot of my colleagues, because we'll bring up Bloomberg Terminal, which we pay an extraordinary amount of money per year to articulate what risks are important to businesses writ large that we're advising on. And there's one piece that's missing, and that's an effectual use of how we interpret water and the water risk in a geopolitical space or a purely physical space to different companies and what they might have to anticipate as a vulnerability in their supply chain. It's not in that quick picture when you pull up a company's responsibility or risk management. So getting CDP as a measure of that unit of change directly, because it is the foremost piece that most of the institutional investor portfolios that we speak to that value it, that's the first in class piece. But that only covers large market cap companies like Unilever. But if you want to get the tipping point over, you need to go to medium, small, or micro cap companies and still get them to also articulate why reporting into CDP would be beneficial for an investor who's pulling up a company on Bloomberg Terminal to see the full risk picture of investing. So for me, like, that's the biggest and most exciting space. And we're looking at technology to meet a moment, is like, where can we continue to get good information in front of decision makers that are usually invisible, right? A lot of people don't understand what really goes into a stewardship policy. And I know we have a couple of people on the call that have been speaking to this, but really, when you have traditional cap-weighted portfolios, it needs to be there as a measure of change.
And that's the panel we need to have to bring small and medium companies to the table to help them understand. And that's something that has a lot of information that needs to be spread. But Frank, before I start the closing question, you've been working with your portfolio companies, the pension funds. How does technology and innovation come in there to help them actually make the changes required?
Maybe I fold the question a little bit. Because I think there's one topic we have not touched upon, and that's not a technology question, but if you look at boards of public companies, we see that on general the level of ESG knowledge and expertise is quite low, let alone on water. So what we have often seen is that we speak to companies which we just see are lacking on water stewardship. We see that in a materiality assessment, they have identified water as an important risk, as important for the business. But if you speak to the board on that topic, you hardly get an answer. And you see that the topic is not discussed on board level, not because they don't deem it important, but they don't have the sufficient expertise or knowledge to discuss those
And I
topics.
think that's
I think, yeah.
Absolutely, Frank.
So
that education is really critical, and that's something that so much conversation we can have about how do you create that understanding and that knowledge from the science-based targets to actually how to deploy them. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here with us today. It's been great to have this conversation. And there's so many other conversations we can have as a result of what's been said. Multiple more editions to be held, clearly, for the Business Accelerator. Thank you all. And ladies and gentlemen, that was Business Accelerator 2022, How to Achieve Water-Wise Investments. Thank you for being with us.